Amid the age of outlaws and gunslingers, tales of some of the most notorious figures would solidify themselves in American culture and folklore, some characters proving more deadly than the other. John Wesley Hardin famously shot a man for snoring too loud next door. The highly regarded gunfight at the OK Corral only lasted 30 seconds. And, if given the chance, a man named Boone Helm was ready to eat you. There's no shortage of stories detailing the brutal way of life that came with braving the American frontier, and one can only imagine the number of stories that were never documented, considering just how bad the known ones can get. Had you or your family braved the Old West, your challenges would have been great, and the environment would have changed you. Despite the good character you came in with, your exterior needed to toughen in order to survive. However, had you already had that hard exterior, or perhaps even corrupted, chances are you would thrive in this environment, maybe a little too well. On January 28, 1828, Levi Boone Helm would enter the world, leaving behind a streak seemingly fit for a morbid work of fiction, but that's sadly not the case. He was born into a highly regarded family in Lincoln County, Kentucky, with 12 siblings. When he was a boy, he and his family moved to Jackson Township in Monroe County, Missouri, just bordering the wilderness beyond civilization. Out of his many siblings, Boone clearly stood out among the rest, notably showing off his skill of retrieving a Bowie knife from the ground while galloping full speed on a horse, but also exhibiting a pattern of troubling behavior. Heavy drinking was apparent, and he became well known to local law over the years. On one occasion, when a sheriff tried to arrest him, Helm instead rode his horse into a courthouse while the circuit court was in session, berating the judge while still on horseback in a dramatic display. He had a known disdain for authority, which wasn't uncommon for budding outlaws. But Boone, unfortunately, harbored a trait that would grow to be the core of his coming actions: complete moral bankruptcy. Come 1851, Boone Helm married 17-year-old Lucinda Frances Browning and shared a daughter named Lucy together. Sadly, the marriage quickly turned into a nightmare, with Lucinda becoming the victim of frequent beatings by Boone during his bouts of drunken rage. The abuse was frequent and ruthless, sometimes including Boone doing so whilst riding his horse into the house, much like he did in the courtroom all those years ago. At some point, Lucinda couldn't take it anymore and petitioned for divorce to finally be free of her husband's constant assaults. Helm's father covered the legal costs and proceedings, which in turn bankrupted him and put shame on the once respected Helm family name. Seeing as there was no reason to stay in Missouri, Boone decided to move away for a new start. California was the destination, and there was a gold rush on. As detailed by his actions so far, the short-tempered man would carry his madness wherever he strayed, and before wiping the slate clean, Helm couldn't even leave Missouri without committing another heinous crime. Intending to have someone accompany his search for treasure, Boone requested that his cousin, Littleberry Shute, join him in the adventure out west. Littleberry initially accepted and planned to brave the frontier with his cousin, but suddenly decided to back out shortly after. And instead of respecting his decision, Boone instantly went into a rage, violently stabbing Littleberry in the chest, and heading out west alone. He wouldn't run long though, because Littleberry's brother and a group of friends pursued Helm and captured him before he could get away. He was taken into custody for the murders, but was eventually transferred to a mental asylum when his violent antics in jail proved too much to bear. Had the brother of Littleberry known what would follow in Boone's next chapter in life, well, he may have reconsidered taking the murderer into custody and delivered justice right there on the spot. Whilst in the mental asylum, Boone Helm was determined to escape by any means necessary. He still had plans for the West, and he wasn't going to let custody get in his way. Realizing his violent ways weren't the proper method to flee from authorities, Boone had an idea to slip away in the most clever way possible, right in front of their eyes. He developed a routine with the guards to take him out on regular walks through the woods surrounding the facility. He did this again and again and again, until his chaperones eventually let their guard down, allowing Boone to walk away without immediate supervision, finally providing a window for him to flee, and flee he did. At last, free from the law, Levi Boone Helm escaped justice and at last made his push for California. This long game of cunning manipulation was more or less the last time the outlaw would demonstrate such patience. In fact, he planned to do the exact opposite. A monster is now on the loose, and a scourge of death is headed to the Golden State. Records are a bit scarce, but most articles state that Helm did not lay low following his break from the asylum. Staying true to his short fuse, he continued his violent behavior, committing an unknown number of assaults and murders both on his way and when he arrived in California. In fact, Boone never seemed to be interested in gold after all, but rather fresh new ground to continue his murderous lifestyle. For example, sometime later, a San Francisco rancher once offered shelter to Helm during his travels. Still, for seemingly no reason, Helm murdered the rancher in cold blood, solidifying his insane nature even further. He left a bloody trail of death and destruction in his wake, robbing and stealing through various territories to his heart's desire, killing men with impunity and never refusing a fight. If callousness and utter savagery were a contest, Boone Helm was likely in the top 3 contendants. Granted, considering the state of the old frontier at the time, coming across rough, violent men was simply a way of life. But in this case, incidents with Helm became all too much. Grudges and personal squabbles weren't required to earn a deadly visit from the man. Rather, records seem to suggest that anyone, anywhere, at any time were open to meet the barrel of Boone's gun without a second thought. All it took were the wrong words, the wrong glance, and the wrong circumstances. But, much like before, the population at large had had enough, marking Boone as a high target for vigilante justice. The community and the law had its fill of Boone Helm, and California was beginning to look much riskier for the killer. At some point, Boone Helm later joined a group of 6 men, intending to travel to Fort Hall, Idaho, for more gold prospects in the Utah Territory. A mining migration was happening out that way, and prospectors sought out Camp Floyd, with Fort Hall serving as a major stop along the way. It would be this trip that served as one of the most infamous settings for Boone Helm's twisted reputation, one that would later dub him as the Kentucky Cannibal. The temperatures were low, the air was frigid, and layers of snow had blanketed the Idaho terrain. Boone and his 6 companions were deep in the middle of their journey when yet another fact of life crossed paths with the men: an ambush. A group of Native Americans attacked the travelers, forcing them further and further into the wilderness, off the beaten path. Although they successfully escaped the natives, doing so set them off course and off schedule. Already short on provisions, the men eventually had no choice but to kill and eat their horses to survive, using their hides to make snowshoes and brave the journey on foot. Eventually, this excursion would cost the lives of the men, one by one, whittling the party down to only Boone Helm and a man named Bunton. The pair continued to push for Fort Hall for some time until Bunton became too weak to go any further. The elements had become too much, and hunger was likely taking hold of both men. Bunton decided to call it quits in an abandoned cabin, but Helm continued to push further for the fort. However, Helm's attempt to resume the journey was interrupted by his own hunger. There was no possible way to reach Fort Hall in his current condition, so he turned back and headed back for the cabin. When he was close, a gunshot. Boone re-entered the cabin, finding that his last companion, Bunton, had just taken his own life. Now alone and facing the same fate as his 6 companions, Helm had a difficult choice to make: die with the rest of them, or survive by any means necessary. He chose the latter. Whilst the body was still fresh, Boone Helm hacked off one of Bunton's legs, cooked it, and ate it. He followed suit with the other leg, this time using cloth from an old shirt to carry it with him for later. Following this grisly event, a man named John W. Powell discovered Helm at an Indian camp and offered to take him to Salt Lake City, Utah, which Helm agreed to. As nice a gesture this was, Boone Helm never paid John Powell for the escort, despite having $1,400 on his person at the time, not even so much as a thank you for his act of kindness. In Boone's world, empathy did not exist. He arrived later in San Francisco, where the incident with the rancher occurred, and seemingly Boone only continued his devilish behavior from the moment he was on his own again. Drinking, fighting, shooting, killing. In fact, this pattern of violence was so great that to this day, no one truly knows the body count of Boone Helm. Only that the final number was likely very high. Not only was he going to murder again, he was also going to eat again. Boone's reputation was like a walking scar. In 1862, he fled California for Oregon, carrying on the same way he always had, robbing who he wanted, often ending in the deaths of many. And just as he did back home, Boone committed yet another crime that deepened his already dark reputation. Drinking heavily once more, Helm gunned down an unarmed man named Dutch Fred in a saloon and fled from the law again. The circumstances around this murder are scarce, but some speculate the killing may have been premeditated. Either way, it was done, and Boone found himself in the spotlight again. With the law hot on his trail, Boone just so happened to meet another fugitive along the way. The details of this second criminal are little to none, but it's understood the pair became companions for a time, before desperate situations in the wilderness presented themselves once again, and Boone murdered his fellow outlaw to consume his body, just as he did with the man named Bunton. Only this time, he did not wait for him to die. There would be no one to save him this time. Boone was apprehended by authorities and taken into custody for the saloon killing, and it looked as if his time was up. He couldn't escape as he once did in the mental asylum, but in this case, Boone Helm had another plan to secure his freedom yet again. Instead, he called upon Old Tex, one of his dozen siblings, for help. We know nothing of Old Tex, including his real name, despite the fact that he seemed to have access to a considerable amount of money which he used to pay off witnesses connected to his brother's case, subsequently freeing him after the law was unable to convict the Mad Killer. Thanks to this convenient ace up his sleeve, Boone Helm was free to roam the country once more, ready to fight again, prepared to kill again, ready to eat again. Old Tex and Boone rode side by side down to the Lone Star State together after avoiding conviction, where Boone expectedly continued his brutal streak of death and robbery for some time. By 1863, the Kentucky Cannibal appeared throughout various settlements across America, doing what he did best for a period. By 1864, Helm became aligned with the infamous Henry Plummer Gang in Montana, a gang worthy of its own entry one day, which consisted of members that operated in similar fashion. Boone, most likely, still standing out as the most brutal. Like most outlaws, though, even Boone Helm had to face the consequences of his long list of crimes someday. That day was not far away. On January 14, 1864, during his time in Plummer's gang, Helm served as a road agent, sticking up stagecoaches and travelers in Virginia City when the Montana Vigilance Committee hunted him down, along with other members of the gang, including Jack Gallagher, Frank Parrish, Hayes Lyons, and George Clubfoot Lane. Bandits had already been plaguing the area around Virginia City, of which the vigilantes had been tirelessly hunting. But with Boone Helm himself being identified amongst them, the law just scored big time with this catch, and this time, they weren't letting him get away. When he and the gang were being closed in on, Boone reportedly said, quote, "If I'd had a chance, or if I had guessed what you were all up to, you'd have never taken me." Under vigilante court, the traditions of formal trial are not present. The point is to process criminals as quickly as possible based on any gathered evidence, usually ending in guilt and sending the accused to the gallows for execution. Boone Helm's case began just the same. He remained defiant during the proceedings, yet again doing all he could to escape justice again. He denied ever murdering anyone in his whole life, notably kissing the Bible multiple times, swearing this over and over before taking the stand. However, this obvious lie fooled absolutely no one, and wouldn't last for long. Despite denying being a road agent, he did confess to murder in Missouri and California, as well as being imprisoned in the past. Instead, he accused Jack Gallagher and the rest of his companions of being road agents in a desperate attempt to throw them under the bus, singling out Jack Gallagher, saying, quote, "He ought to die." This was all in vain. George Clubfoot Lane, Hayes Lyons, Jack Gallagher, and Boone Helm were all sentenced to hanging that same day. Out of all the men, Helm proved to be the least affected by the verdict, saying, quote, "I have looked at death in all forms, and I am not afraid to die," then asking for a glass of whiskey. No one was here to save Helm or the Plummer gang this time. No family, quick thinking, or clever tricks. After all these years, Boone's horrific spree was coming to an end in Virginia City. The civilian-led mob rounded up the 5 men and prepared gallows at a partially built log building, where ropes were thrown over the ridgepole at the front of the building for the public to see. Over 6,000 people came to witness the execution that day. When ready, the criminals were marched there and placed on boxes intended to drop down, one by one. Even as dramatic and overstimulating this must have been, Boone kept his cool. He was calm, devoid of any emotion or indications of fear. If there was a close second to his reaction, that would be given to Frank Parrish, who remained silent during this time. Hayes Lyons pleaded for his life until the very end, earlier begging to see his mistress one last time, but was denied. George Clubfoot Lane expressed remorse for his actions, followed by saying farewell to his partners in crime. As for Jack Gallagher, he was probably the most nervous of them all, clearly disheveled and in no way coming to terms with what was about to happen. When this was apparent to Boone Helm, he told Jack, quote, "There's no use being afraid to die." In fact, Helm's sore finger from the rope that bound him seemed to bother him more than his impending doom. He even reportedly exclaimed, quote, "For God's sakes, if you're going to hang me, I want you to do it and get through with it. If not, I want you to tie up my finger for me." Before you knew it, Clubfoot Lane jumped off his box to deny his executioners the satisfaction, in which Helm commented, quote, "There's another one gone to hell." Jack Gallagher was next in line, tossed off the box, although his neck didn't break. As he hung by the neck, flailing helplessly, Boone said to him, quote, "Kick away, old fellow." Following the hanging of his last 2 comrades, Hayes Lyons and Frank Parrish, Boone Helm continued with his oddly resolved demeanor up until the bitter end. Morbidly, he yelled, quote, "My turn next. I'll be in hell with you in a minute." And serving as his last words, the killer shouted, quote, "Every man has his principles. "Hurrah for Jeff Davis, let her rip," referring to the President of the Confederate States of America, and jumped off the box, taking his own life in one last act of defiance. He's currently buried in Boot Hill Cemetery in Virginia City, a place reserved for troublesome individuals at the time. 14 days shy of his 36th birthday, Levi Boone Helm faced justice at last, after living a young life that one could categorize as nothing short of demonic. Among most stories covering famous figures of the Old West, we found that Boone Helm stood out as one of the most bloodthirsty and disturbing. His earliest known records already displayed a troubling sign of what was to come, but we highly doubt anyone close to him could have imagined the depths in which he'd fallen. Even the gray areas of his life are highly suggested to have been rife with violence, just as the moments we know more details about. Which leads one to wonder just how many more met an early death because of Boone Helm's quickness to rage. Just how many victims could he have had in total? How many had he robbed, stole from, injured in his life? And yet, more morbidly, how many more people did he eat that we don't know about?